This is the Low Country, a place where the air itself seems weighted by history and sin. The earth here is not merely soil, it is a repository of unpayable debt. For the wealthy of the 1800 South, a name was a sacred, fragile thing, and the collapse of credit was a fate worse than death. Look upon Drayton Plantation. It stands vast and decaying, a monument to the lie of perpetual prosperity. The columns are no longer white, but streaked with the green and yellow stain of mold and neglect. The house itself is slowly surrendering to the swamp that surrounds it, mirroring the ruin of the man who ruled it. The master, Josiah Rutledge, clung to the rituals of his station. He hosted the dinners, he maintained the severe discipline, but beneath his fine waistcoat, his fear was a cold, constant tremor. He had tried to hide the truth for years, selling land in secret, liquidating heirlooms with a casual lie. But the debt was a living thing, and its appetite only grew, patient and absolute. The crisis arrived in the form of the Thorn Note. A demand for final, immediate payment from a creditor who held no respect for social standing. Rutledge faced the final terror, the erasure of the Rutledge name from history. The desperation shattered him, driving him into the dark, brandy-soaked sanctuary of his study. He raged against the bankers and the lawyers, but his true enemy was his own empty ledger. His eyes fell upon the portrait of his daughter, the heiress, Miss Charlotte. He knew the terrible, final solution the law allowed. He could not pay in money, so he would pay in blood, the blood that carried his own name. He would sell the heiress into a strategic, brutal marriage. She is valuable, he thought, clutching the portrait, his voice a broken whisper in the dark. She is my final deed. The name will survive. He convinced himself he was a savior, protecting his lineage, unaware that in that moment, he was merely completing an auction he did not control. He was trading the person he claimed to love for the pride he worshipped. Meanwhile, the heiress moved through the house in a state of suspended panic. Charlotte's lace-draped world was a suffocating cage. She had witnessed her father's collapse, the frantic whispers, the escalating cruelty, and she knew, instinctively, that her body was the final currency of the house. She was refined, educated, and, in the eyes of the law, a high-value piece of property. Unseen, yet ever-present, was the servant, Elias. A master craftsman, a man whose physical presence the master dismissed as mere utility, but whose intellect was sharp and focused. Elias was intimately aware of the house's tremors. He moved in the periphery, saw what the master carelessly discarded, and in the torn scrap of legal paper, he saw the entire, horrific transaction laid bare. The master intended to sell the heiress. The moment of truth arrived. Elias knew he could use his own life savings to buy his freedom and simply disappear. But to do so was to allow the system to win, to let the master escape his moral judgment. Justice demanded a higher price. Elias would use his wealth not to free himself, but to purchase the moral submission of the very heiress who legally owned him. He would forfeit his physical liberty to gain complete, hidden ownership of the master's entire legacy. The final, terrifying contract was ready to be written. The oppressive darkness of the master's study gives way to the contrasting, focused quiet of the slave quarters. This small, rough carpentry workshop is not a place of despair, but a sanctuary of industry. The air is dry, smelling of freshly planed lumber and linseed oil, the scent of honest work. This is the hidden economy of the South. The master's world operated on borrowed time and credit, but here, the currency was time earned and skill mastered. The servant, Elias, was the architect of this parallel market. Legally, he was chattel, a mere tool on the master's ledger. In reality, he was a master craftsman, a man of precise calculation and unwavering discipline. His work was a form of silent resistance. The master rented him out to the neighbors, pocketing the fee, blind to the network Elias built with that privilege. The extra hours, the commissions whispered in back alleys of the town, the tasks performed after the master was asleep, these were not wasted. They were converted into a single, precious commodity, stored life. Elias stands before his bench. His tools, the chisels, the block plane, are maintained with a meticulous care that honors the craft, not the owner. He pauses now, moving to a spot near the back wall, where the packed earth floor is slightly disturbed. He kneels, his strong hands easily lifting the loose, heavy floorboard. Beneath, nestled in the cool, dry earth, is the visible sum of his existence, a heavy, leather pouch, sagging with antique silver and foreign gold coin. This was not merely money, this was years of risk, years of denial, years of living beneath the notice of the white world. The coins clink, a low, deep, satisfying sound of earned liberty. The sum was precise, calculated against the volatile market price of human beings. It was enough. Enough to purchase his own freedom, to secure his papers, and to remove himself and his remaining kin from the entire, morally poisoned landscape of the Drayton name. He had performed the impossible. His hands had paid his ransom. He was poised to step out of the shadow and into his own, hard-won light. It was in this moment of quiet victory that the message arrived. A hurried, coded whisper, a small scrap of paper slipped to him by a nervous boy from the yard. The note detailed the master's terror, the crushing weight of the thorn note, and the master's final, terrible plan. The heiress, Miss Charlotte, was to be sacrificed. Elias understood the heiress's fate immediately. She was to be sold into an alliance, her life becoming the permanent collateral that preserved the master's pride. He looked at the gold on the floor and looked toward the distant, faint light of the main house. The choice was stark, clear, and devastating. He could take the gold, walk away, and secure his own survival. He could let the white world tear itself apart, watching the master's house and the heiress's future collapse under the weight of its own sin. Survival was the simplest, most human choice. But justice demanded more than survival. Justice, in this place, was not a simple exchange of coin for legal papers. It required a fatal shift in power, a moral leverage that would utterly corrode the master's world from the inside. Elias knew that to walk free was to relinquish his final, most potent weapon. To purchase his own freedom was to accept the system's terms. To achieve a justice that transcended the law, he had to forfeit his liberty. He had to remain on the land, not as the master's property, but as the master's ultimate, unseen creditor. He would use his stored life not for his own emancipation, but to purchase the moral submission of the heiress. He would buy the means to control her action, her conscience, and, through her, the destruction of her father's entire world. The immense sum of his earnings, his ticket to freedom, was now merely the down payment on an unpayable moral obligation. He would trade his physical chain for a far more powerful, psychological key. The servant would use his gold to buy his master's daughter, ensuring that her life would serve his singular, relentless purpose, the total, irrevocable ruin of Drayton. The hour was late, and the plantation was wrapped in a suffocating blanket of silence. The negotiation could not occur in the master's gilded, decaying house. It required neutral ground, a place outside the system of ownership, yet deeply familiar to the land. They met in the smokehouse, a rough-hewn, low-slung building smelling of old salt, preserved meat, and damp brick. It was a space defined by preservation, the perfect setting for a contract that would preserve a life at the cost of a soul. The heiress, Miss Charlotte, arrived first. She wore a simple, dark dressing gown, a concession to secrecy, but the lace at her throat was a painful reminder of her rank. Her fear was cold and absolute. She had learned the master's fate. Her father had sealed her marriage to Thorne, trading her for solvency. She saw no escape but flight, a path that was impossible for a woman of her station. She saw him waiting. The servant, Elias, stood against the cold brick wall, a figure of absolute stillness and controlled power. He was not dressed in the coarse slave linen, but in simple, clean work clothes, the uniform of a man who commanded his own materials. Charlotte. Her voice, a raw, difficult whisper, "It is true, then. He has done it. He has traded me. You know this is true." Elias did not offer comfort. He did not deny the cruelty. He offered only the truth of the transaction, the cold, hard reality of the world they inhabited. Elias. The master has traded you, Miss Charlotte. He is trading your comfort for his name. But that trade is void. I have purchased your debt. He moved toward the rough-hewn workbench in the center of the room. Slowly, deliberately, he slid a heavy, bulging leather pouch across the dusty wood. The pouch, containing years of his earned life, stopped inches from her hand. Elias. This is the total sum of the thorn note. It is purchased not by your father's empty pride, but by my labor. You will take this before dawn. You will deliver it to the lawyer, anonymously. The master's debt will be cleared. You will not marry Thorn. Charlotte stared at the pouch. It was an impossible image, the life savings of the man her father owned, the visible embodiment of his stolen time, now offered for her survival. She pushed it back toward him, her hands trembling violently. Charlotte. This is your freedom. Your life. You would forfeit your life to save his house? To save me? Why? Elias. I forfeit my freedom to purchase leverage. To secure a greater justice than the law can offer. The moment that gold settles the master's account, he will believe he is safe. You will be free from Thorn, but you will be bound by an obligation more absolute than marriage. He took her hands, a shocking, intimate breach of social code, and firmly closed her fingers around the leather pouch. His touch was not tender, it was definitive. It was the sealing of the contract. Elias. You will wake up every morning in the house that I preserved, wearing the name I salvaged. Your entire existence will be a constant, daily reminder of the physical freedom I gave up for your moral submission. You will no longer belong to your father. You will belong to the truth you have purchased. Charlotte. A realization that chills her to the core, you are trading your deed for mine. You will remain here. You become my master. Elias. I will remain here. The debt is absolute. You are the heiress, protected by the legal structure, yet spiritually and morally owned by the servant who chose to sacrifice his life for your position. You must recognize your new station. This is the price of your conscience. Charlotte clutched the heavy pouch, the weight of the gold now feeling like the anchor of a new, terrible chain. The fear of Thorn was replaced by the terrifying, chilling clarity of her servitude to Elias. Charlotte. Her voice dropping to an oath, I accept. I will perform this service. What is the first requirement of my new master? The payment is due. Elias. Truth. Obedience. And silence. The master has secrets far deeper than his debt. Secrets that explain the sudden disappearances in the county, the unnatural fear he carries, the real reason behind the strange rituals. The master's debt is paper. His crime is blood. I require the map to his absolute, unrecoverable ruin. The journey begins in the basement. The cold, salt-laced air of the smokehouse felt suddenly charged, the weight of the new contract, secured not by legal signature but by an unpayable debt of conscience, settling upon the heiress. She had been freed from one brutal fate only to walk willingly into another, a deeper form of bondage defined by shared, necessary treason. She was the heiress sold to her servant. The sun rose over Drayton Plantation in a blaze of false hope. The transaction was complete, the gold had moved anonymously through the necessary channels, and the thorn note was settled. The master, Rutledge, had been saved from ruin, and his relief was a loud, vulgar roar that echoed through the formerly quiet house. He believed in the hand of God, in the sacred power of his name, and in a stroke of incredible, inexplicable luck. He was utterly blind to the fact that his solvency was now purchased entirely by the man he legally owned, and that his life was alone secured by his daughter's conscience. The master sat at the grand dining table, dressed in fresh linen, his face flushed with the kind of aggressive self-congratulation that only comes after near failure. Rutledge. Providence. An intervention. I tell you, Charlotte, the name is saved. They tried to sink me, but the Rutledges are preserved by the very heavens. The heiress, Miss Charlotte, sat across from him. Outwardly, she was the epitome of the dutiful daughter, immaculately dressed, her posture flawless. Inwardly, she was a study in profound, chilling transformation. The neurotic fragility that had defined her, the nervous hands, the downcast eyes, was gone. Her gaze was level, distant, and utterly devoid of filial affection. She understood the currency now. Her physical comfort, the silver service, the safety of her name, all were purchased by the immense, quiet sacrifice of the servant, Elias. Every sip of coffee, every gleam of the heavy silverware, was a constant, damning reflection of her unpayable moral debt. She was trapped not in a gilded cage, but in a spiritual prison, an unwilling sentinel of Elias's unseen authority. Her composure was not peace, it was the ruthless focus required by treason. She retreated to her private sitting room. She moved with a purpose she had never possessed before, driven by the crystalline focus of her new, terrible purpose. The debt had stripped her of her victimhood, forcing upon her the terrifying agency of the accomplice. She sat at her needlepoint, an activity considered appropriate for a lady. Her hands, however, were not idle in the creation of beauty. She reached into her sewing basket, pulling out a small, ornate silver thimble. Hidden beneath the lining was a tightly folded scrap of paper covered in the precise, coded script Elias had used. The instruction was her first task, the first installment of her debt. The servant's demand was not for further coin or emotional recompense, it was for the intellectual key to the master's ruin. The coded message, translated using a simple cipher based on the numbering of the Psalms, required access to her father's most private archive, a locked cabinet behind his desk. The act was more than simple espionage, it was the final, total breach of trust. She had to violate the sacred space of her father's authority, confirming that she was now fully an agent of his destruction. Her hands closed around the thimble, feeling the subtle sharpening of its tip, Elias's final instruction to turn a feminine accessory into an instrument of criminal entry. She was to perform a subtle surgery on the master's life, extracting the fatal secret he guarded above all else. She spent the day moving through the house, observing her father. He was drunk with relief and arrogance, throwing parties, writing new business proposals, entirely consumed by the idea of external enemies and the brilliance of his supposed recovery. He was incapable of seeing the profound, quiet betrayal moving seamlessly around him. The heiress was no longer fighting for her own survival, which was now secured. She was fighting for the justice of the man whose physical life she had, indirectly, ruined. The haunting quality of her new existence was the terrifying knowledge that the destruction of Drayton was now entirely dependent on her unflinching obedience to its former servant. She waited for the darkness, preparing for the true night's work. The house, oblivious to the moral reversal within its walls, rested under the weight of the lie that had just saved it. The house was submerged in the deepest hour of night. The only sounds were the faint creak of the old wood and the distant, restless hum of the low-country swamp. The heiress, Miss Charlotte, moved through the dark hallway, her silk dressing gown a slight, pale blur against the oppressive gloom. Her movements were not rushed, they were defined by a deadly, meticulous control, the signature of her new servitude. The debt demanded this violation. She had to breach the most protected space in her life, the physical and ideological heart of her father's authority, his study. It was a space secured not just by a lock, but by the unquestioned covenant of patriarchal power. She reached the heavy, polished oak door. She did not hesitate. Her father had long been sedated by his celebratory evening, fallen into the deep, breathless slumber of the utterly self-satisfied man. Inside the study, the air was heavy, stale with the lingering fumes of brandy and old, expensive paper. Moonlight, fractured and weak, strained through the velvet drapes. Charlotte went directly to the imposing mahogany desk, the nexus of the master's financial ruin and his self-preservation. Her target was the archive, a deeply recessed cabinet built into the wall behind the desk, locked with a small, intricate brass mechanism. She knelt before the cabinet. From the sleeve of her gown, she produced the simple, transformed instrument, the silver sewing thimble, its tip now filed to a thin, sharp point, just as the servant, Heiress, had instructed. The tool of her gentle, expected confinement was now the instrument of her father's utter destruction. Heiress understood that true power lay in the conversion of the overlooked. She inserted the filed tip into the lock. Her focus was absolute, her breath held tight in her chest. A terrifying, minute sound, the scratch of metal against metal, followed by a shocking, sharp, yet contained click as the lock gave way. She had violated the sanctuary. She pulled the heavy cabinet door inward. Inside, among dusty, common ledgers and sealed documents, was the true archive, a single, unmarked book bound in thick, dark, oiled leather. It was warm to the touch, as if holding a residual, terrible energy. This was not a financial record. This was the true, meticulous chronicle of moral transactions, the shadow history of Drayton and the surrounding county. She opened the ledger. The writing was her father's familiar, elegant business hand, but the content was a register of crimes and secret oaths. She was tracing the cold path of her father's soul. Using the cipher Heiress had taught her, a code built on numbered biblical psalms, an irony that was not lost on her, she deciphered the chilling entries. They detailed not merely fraudulent business deals, but ritualistic power plays, violence masked as legal process, and the absolute abuse of their position. She finally found the entry Heiress sought. A notation marked simply, necessary disposal. L. Thorn matter. 3 years ago. And then, a series of coordinates and a single, chilling name, the name of the man who had vanished from the local slave quarters 3 years prior, a man suspected to be Elias's own kin. The truth, once suspected, was now documented, undeniable murder. In that moment, the debt was fully crystallized. Her father was not just a failing businessman, he was a conspirator and a killer. Her act of betrayal was no longer simply treason against her class, it was a sacred duty to justice. Suddenly, a heavy thud from the master bedroom hallway. The master was stirring. Charlotte froze, the blood draining from her face, the massive, incriminating ledger clutched against her chest. Discovery now meant certain madness, her father's permanent public disgrace, and the absolute failure of the covenant she had sworn to Heiress. With frantic speed, yet still maintaining a semblance of control, she copied the critical details of the entry onto a scrap of paper, her charcoal moving with dizzying haste. She shoved the leather-bound book back into its recess, closed the cabinet door, and delicately reset the lock using the thimble. She fled the room just as she heard the master's heavy, confused footsteps begin to move down the hall, likely returning to the comfort of his brandy. She had completed the surgical strike. The paper in her hand was the intellectual key to the master's absolute ruin, proof of the conspiracy, the blood debt, and the deep, dark secret that required a physical resting place. The journey to the plantation's basement had begun. The heiress and the servant met again in the profound, consuming darkness of the late night. The air was cold now, pulled in from the swamp, carrying the smell of stagnant water and decaying leaves. The secrecy demanded that their movements be flawless, their communication non-verbal, rooted in the shared knowledge of their high-stakes treason. The information Charlotte extracted from the archive was the intellectual blueprint of the conspiracy. But the master was a powerful man, paper could be dismissed, and accusations could be denied. To achieve the absolute, irreversible ruin Heiress demanded, they required physical proof, an object secured by the ancient covenant of the earth itself. Charlotte, guided by the memory of her father's feverish, drunken ramblings and the coordinates in the ledger, led Heiress to a rarely used service entrance near the kitchen pantry. She moved with a strange, unnatural grace now, her old nervousness replaced by the cold, clear focus of the condemned. She touched a barely visible seam in the wall paneling. Heiress pressed the spot. With a terrifying, deep groan of dry wood and rusted iron, a narrow, heavy wooden door swung inward. It revealed a steep flight of stone steps descending into a blackness so complete it seemed to swallow the light. Cold, damp air rushed out, carrying a faint, unsettling odor of earth, salt, and something metallic. This was not a common root cellar. This was the place the master kept his deeper accounts. Charlotte descended first, her lantern beam weak and trembling, cutting a narrow path into the subterranean gloom. Elias followed, his presence a solid, grounding shadow. The descent felt like a passage through time, leaving the civilized decay of the house for a more elemental, brutal truth beneath. The chamber was vast, lined with rough-cut, primitive stone. It was dominated by a single, massive, flat altar stone set into the floor in the center of the room. The stone was dark, mottled, and unnaturally smooth, a table for terrible, private rites. Charlotte. He spoke of it. When he was medicated. A fever dream, he called it. The robes, the chalice, he called it the purification. She spoke with a steady voice, the memory finally rescued from the hysterical fog her father had tried to impose on her. The truth was worse than the madness he had cultivated. This was the crucible of the Brethren, the secret society where the master affirmed his authority through ritual, violence, and documented, absolute malice. Elias did not look at the altar stone. He moved to the rough perimeter wall, his light tracing the stone surface. He found low, faint scratch marks, almost like crude tally marks, scored deep into the masonry. These were the servants' own records, tracking the unpunished disappearances that plagued the plantation. Elias. The murder is recorded in the ledger. The missing man is remembered on the wall. But the object that binds the entire conspiracy, the absolute, undeniable proof, it is not here. Charlotte, her eyes now burning with a cold, terrifying clarity, moved to the base of the central altar stone. She remembered a phrase her father had uttered in his deepest, most drunken sleep, a phrase that made no sense then, but was chillingly clear now: the archive rests where the spirit is bound. She pointed to a faint, deliberate inscription carved into the deep stone foundation. She and Elias exchanged a look of perfect, terrible understanding. The final archive was hidden beneath the altar itself. Together, they placed their combined strength against the massive slab. With a heavy, terrible grind of stone against stone, the altar slowly, reluctantly slid away, revealing a dark, square, earthen compartment beneath. The vault of the Brethren was revealed. The sealed contents of the compartment contained the undeniable, physical proof, a collection of bloodied tokens, tiny silver pins bearing the society's crest, sealed confessions from co-conspirators, and a final, coded roster of the Brethren, the true masters of the county. Elias reached down, retrieving a single, tightly wrapped oilcloth package. He held the weight of it in his hand, a weight that was heavier than all the gold he had saved. The debt was paid in full. The heiress had risked her sanity and her life to breach the inner sanctum and procure the master's final, irreversible ruin. Elias held the physical currency of absolute, public justice. The time for petitioning the law was over. The time for demanding his own, personal retribution had begun. He and Charlotte pushed the altar stone back into place. The loud thud of stone against stone felt like the sealing of a grave, and the end of the old world. Days passed, and the atmosphere inside Drayton Plantation did not settle, it curdled. The master, Josiah Rutledge, was saved from the public shame of bankruptcy, yet the anomaly of his rescue became a slow-acting poison in his mind. He knew, instinctively, that he should have fallen, that the hand of fate had pushed him to the brink. The fact that he stood intact drove him to an agonizing, sleepless paranoia. The ultimate leverage Elias possessed was not the physical evidence, but Rutledge's own guilt. He was consumed by the idea of unseen forces, convinced that Thorne had planted an agent, a spy, to watch his final humiliation. He suspected everyone, the overseer, the few remaining business partners, the very heir itself. Master Rutledge moved through his house a figure of aggressive terror. He abandoned his fine suits for a stained, open dressing gown, clutching the stopper of his decanter. He would stand at the windows for hours, screaming at the field hands merely for looking toward the main house. Rutledge. They are watching me. They smell the weakness. They circle. The dogs. His paranoia was achieving its desired effect. He was actively dismantling his own defenses. He mistrusted his lockbox, his mail, his own memories. He failed, utterly and tragically, to suspect the one person whose composure was flawless, the one person whose loyalty he still took for granted. Miss Charlotte, the heiress, moved through the wreckage of his sanity with an unnatural, chilling calm. Her obedience was perfect, her presence seamless. She anticipated his demands, ensuring the lamps burned through the night and the brandy was never empty. Her flawless performance was the ultimate form of betrayal. Her composure was a constant, damning reflection of his increasing madness. He saw the turmoil in his own mind and projected it onto the world, incapable of looking at the pristine, elegant agent of his destruction. Late that night, under the cover of a dense fog that had rolled in from the swamp, Charlotte met the servant, Elias, near the overgrown stables. Charlotte. He is breaking. His mind is shattered with suspicion. How much longer can this hold? Elias. The master's ruin must be final. His name must be erased by a force he cannot deny. He will not be struck down by the law of men, he will be struck down by the law of his own secrets. Elias presented her with a wax-sealed packet. It was lighter than the parcel of evidence from the cellar, yet it carried an immense, spiritual weight. Elias. We have the proof of the blood debt. Now, we create the perfect narrative of betrayal. He must be struck down by the law, using his own secrets. For that, I require the final, absolute payment of your debt. The final demand was not for further espionage. It was for the complete, voluntary sacrifice of her remaining public life. Elias required the heiress to formalize her treason. He handed her the packet, a single document, an official accusation of treason, murder, and conspiracy, addressed to the state magistrate. It was written in a formal, damning legal hand. The master's end would not come from an external attack, but from the fatal mistake of trusting his own lineage. He would be destroyed not by the servant, but by the heiress whose life the servant had bought. The fog was heavy, thick, and white, erasing the boundaries between the swamp and the grounds, creating a world defined only by shadow and proximity. Charlotte and Elias stood near the overgrown stable yard, separated by the immense consequence of the wax-sealed packet Elias held. The servant had achieved his goal. He possessed the physical proof of the master's blood debt, the ritual tokens from the basement. Now, he demanded the final, spiritual surrender. Elias held out the packet. It was an accusation of treason, murder, and high conspiracy, addressed to the county magistrate. It was written in a clean, educated hand, the language of the law used to indict the very men who created it. Charlotte. Her voice tight, strangled with the finality of the act, they will never forgive this. Even if he is convicted, they will call me mad. My name will be ruined. Elias. Ruin is the only currency left, Miss Charlotte. Your name is the last piece of the master's authority that must be destroyed. The accusation must come from within the house, from the blood that has willingly rejected him. If this fails, the charge is dismissed as the hysteria of a distraught heir. If it succeeds, the world will remember you as the willing agent of your family's disgrace. He produced a fine-tipped quill pen, holding it steady, an instrument of irrevocable commitment. Elias. The master's survival was purchased by the forfeiture of my freedom. Your ultimate freedom, the freedom of your conscience, must be purchased by the forfeiture of your reputation. You must become the documented traitor to your own class. The pen hovered. Charlotte looked at the stark white parchment, then at the strong, dark hand holding the quill. This was the moment of complete, voluntary enslavement to her own moral code. She would sever every bond to the world that had raised her, sacrificing the only identity she had ever known. Charlotte. A breath, cold and absolute, I accept. I want nothing left of him. She took the quill. Her hand, usually so delicate and steady on a teacup, moved across the heavy paper. The inscription of her name, Charlotte Rutledge, was steady, deliberate, a signature of permanent war against her own lineage. The signing was the most profound act of treason she could perform. She had formalized her debt. The servant had demanded his final price, and the heiress had paid it in the full currency of her social soul. Elias took the document back, folding it carefully. It was now more than an accusation, it was a spiritual declaration of war. Elias. The document is perfect. The magistrate requires one final, compelling narrative. The accusation must appear to have been forced, discovered by an outside enemy, yet sourced from inside the study. It is time for the master to confirm his own ruin. The plan was now set in motion, the evidence would be planted, the law would be summoned, and the master, already consumed by his own paranoia, would rush directly toward his own trap. He would be destroyed not by the servant, but by the daughter whose life the servant had purchased. The first breath of the new day, a cold, indifferent gray light, began to touch the moss-draped oaks. The hour demanded speed, precision, and absolute commitment. The servant and the heiress had reached the point of no return. The final act of treason required not violence, but meticulous stagecraft. The master's ruin had to appear as a sudden, shocking discovery by an outside authority, triggered by an act of careless guilt on his part. Miss Charlotte, the heiress, moved through the main house, a silent, disciplined figure carrying the instruments of her father's destruction, the dark leather ledger from the cellar, the bloodied ritual token, and the signed accusation, bearing her own name. She entered the master's study. Master Rutledge was slumped in his chair, unconscious, defeated by his own brandy and paranoia. She executed the plan with chilling calm. She placed the massive, incriminating ledger and the ritual tokens deep inside the master's private wall safe. Then, crucially, she committed the final, calculated act of exposure. She left the safe door slightly ajar, the edge of the leather ledger just visible in the gloom. Next, she placed the signed accusation, bearing the name Charlotte Rutledge, and the coded roster of the brethren onto the surface of his desk. She positioned them subtly, resting under the edge of one of his own loose legal papers, making them appear half-hidden, half-discovered, a secret he had tried, and failed, to conceal. The setup was complete. The master would wake to the horrifying realization that his deepest secrets, the ritual conspiracy, the blood debt, and the betrayal of his own daughter, were exposed, all because of his own final, drunken carelessness. Charlotte slipped out just as the master stirred, waking with a desperate, guttural gasp. Master Rutledge lifted his head, his eyes focusing on the papers on his desk. He saw the list of his co-conspirators, the damning words of the brethren. His gaze then snapped to the wall safe, standing open, a physical betrayal revealing the deeper secrets inside. Rutledge. A strangled, panicked cry, Thorn. The dog. He has breached me. He has sent an agent into my house. They have corrupted the staff. He did not suspect Charlotte. He immediately blamed his rival, convinced the sabotage was a final act of external vengeance. His lifelong belief in his own power had made him blind to the betrayal of his own blood. He bolted from the room, running wildly down the long, moss-draped avenue of oaks. He ran directly toward his fate, his guilt written on his face, confirming his entire crime with his own panicked confession. The camera shifts to the end of the long avenue. A dark, severe carriage, bearing the official seal of the county magistrate, had silently pulled to a stop in the mist. Elias, the servant, had sent the anonymous, coded warning only moments after Charlotte left the study. The master's frantic state, rushing toward the law with guilt consuming his every step, was all the proof the magistrate needed to justify the arrest. Rutledge screamed and struggled as the men from the carriage roughly subdued him, dragging him away from the house he had thought he had saved. Rutledge. Treason. Betrayal. I am innocent. They lied. The servant, Elias, watched the entire scene unfold from the deep shadow of the workshop entrance. He was motionless, a statue of absolute resolve. The victory was complete. The master's shame was public, his ruin irreversible, secured not by a slave revolt, but by the relentless, cold precision of a legal and moral ambush. He was destroyed by his own meticulously kept records, and by the daughter whose life the servant had purchased. The house of Drayton settled into an unnatural quiet. The removal of the master, the public humiliation, and the seizure of his property by the state left a void, a deep, unsettling silence where his frantic, manic paranoia once resided. The law had claimed him, and the conspiracy of the brethren would unravel under the weight of the evidence secured from the cellar. Yet, the legal victory felt hollow. Justice, in this poisoned place, was not a matter of court records, it was a matter of internal, unpayable debt. Miss Charlotte, the heiress, stood in the center of the study. The wall safe was empty, its secrets now exposed to the light. She was the sole heir, the nominal owner of the property. But she was also the documented traitor, the betrayer of her own blood. She had purchased her conscience by destroying her name, and she was more deeply bound than ever before. She walked to the window, looking out across the cotton fields toward the quarters. Elias was visible in the distance, working the soil with a steady, methodical purpose, still wearing the clothes of a servant. Her relationship with him was the only truth that remained. It was a bond secured by shared, irreversible treason. He had traded his physical freedom for her moral servitude. Now, both were tied to a collapsed estate, bound by a shared purpose that transcended mere ownership. Later that day, Charlotte met Elias one final time, near the overgrown kitchen gardens where their treacherous partnership had been formalized. Charlotte. The magistrate will seize the property. The estate's debts are vast, despite the saving of the Thorn note. I have been ruined, as you required. Elias. The property must be sold. It is the only way to cleanse the name. Charlotte. Her voice quiet, strained with finality, I signed the deed of accusation. I destroyed my name to save the truth. The payment is due, Elias. What is my final instruction? What is the final claim of my new master? Elias looked at her, his expression unreadable, devoid of the emotion she now carried. He did not offer absolution or comfort. Elias. Your debt is paid, Miss Charlotte. I demanded the ruin of the master and the preservation of the truth. That is finished. My freedom was used to secure your conviction. It is not yours to return, nor mine to claim back. He turned, taking a slow, deliberate step away, walking toward the road that led off the property. He was no longer running toward freedom, he was simply walking into it, carrying only the tools he had earned. Elias. You have control of the sale, Miss Charlotte. Do what must be done to the land. You have learned the currency of justice. His answer was the ultimate, final act of power. He released her from the debt not out of mercy, but out of a total, final control. He had used her as the perfect instrument to strike down the corruption, and having achieved that, he simply released her to the devastating consequences of her choices. Charlotte stood alone, watching him go. She was left with the devastating truth, the house was hers to manage, but the burden was absolute. The plantation, the symbol of her family's sin and her own moral awakening, must be undone. She was free from her father, free from the threat of thorn, but forever bound by the knowledge of her deeds. The heiress was sold to her servant, and the price of that contract was the complete surrender of her former life. The servant walked free, leaving the master's daughter forever bound to the moral destruction she had willingly unleashed.